Yeah, we have some Fast. Yeah. Of course.
Just can't. Okay.
It won't end ever.
How many more days do we actually have? Now we're teachers, and that's the worst part. How many more days do we have for teachers? That's the question. Because
Good evening. The purpose of this meeting is to conduct the business of Gettysburg Area School District. Public comment is welcome, and issues we refer to the appropriate board, committee, or administrator. Excuse me. Comments will be summarized in the official board minutes, which are made available by contacting the business office. There will be a short administrative conference with the board, reference a personnel matter immediately following the meeting. Ms. Collins, everybody's present with the exception of Tim and Ryan, and both of those individuals are excused this evening. Please stand for the pledge of allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The notices and communications the board has in front of them. That brings us to citizens' participation. Al?
Thank you, President Hassinger. We have one individual that has requested to address the board this evening, Mr. Bob Stillo.
Mr. President, I address you tonight on behalf of Gettysburg Area School District property owners, including myself, who are concerned about the history and skeptical about the future of the school district's financial management. Let me begin with a bit of history. From its founding in the late 1600s to the 1700s, and for much of the 1800s, this Commonwealth was a predominantly agrarian economy. A relatively few big landowners controlled most of the productive farmland. Land was the underpinnings of wealth and the source of almost all income. Thus, it made perfect sense to tax the landowners according to the amount of property they owned, in an indirect way, taxing the income the land produced. With the arrival of our industrial society in the 1800s, that changed. Most, if not all of you, own your own home. How many of your homes produce income? Yet we continue to tax homeowners as though their homes actually did. As a result, between 10,000 and 16,000 properties, mostly homes, but some businesses and farms, are lost to property tax sales in this state every year. With the annual inflation rate soaring past 9% this year, those numbers are expected to shoot up. The property tax is the most vile, despicable, regressive, and unfair tax one can levy on an industrial economy. It hurts the low-income poor and the elderly on fixed incomes in a grossly disproportionate way. is rightly and widely despised. There have even been suicides by homeowners at the very time the sheriff arrived to seize their homes because they had nowhere else to go. I wrote about one such death in a letter to the Gettysburg Times. As you start to think about yet another likely unnecessary tax increase, think for a moment how you may be pushing some of your most poor and elderly neighbors on fixed Social Security incomes who are already trying to deal with high inflation closer to losing their homes because they can no longer afford to rent them from the school district. Thomas Jefferson once observed, nothing is ours which another may deprive us of. Mrs. Wallen at the last two board meetings has done a yeoman's job of listing cost increases she thinks you should consider during the coming budget deliberations. What is troubling is what Mrs. Wallen did not tell you. To begin, there are the persistent and outrageous reserve funds balances that just won't go away. Once again, for at least the 5th year in a row, the audit has exposed reserves exceeding the statutory limit. The previous auditor even took special care to note that the administration has adopted an interesting new policy of putting some of the unassigned reserve fund, amounting to $3 to $4 million each year, into a new category, curiously called assigned budget reserve, purportedly for the purposes of balancing the following year's budget. You can find those funds in the PDE 2028 budget filing that Mr. Hassinger and Dr. Perrin signed last June. Look on page 13. Inasmuch as the board has the authority to use the unassigned fund directly to make up any budgetary shortfall, one might be rightly suspicious that this is nothing but an accounting gimmick to make the unassigned fund balance look more acceptable. It doesn't. These two funds together reveal that you are still sitting on a pile of taxpayers' cash well outside your authority. Not only are you in violation of your own policy number 622, which limits reserves, you are also in violation of section 688 of the Pennsylvania Public School Code of 1949, as amended in 2003, which states clearly that your reserves may not exceed 8% of budgeted expenses, about $5.7 million. The other $3 to $4 million that you are not entitled to hold came from the taxpayers' pocketbooks. Where is it in this administration's proposal to bring this into compliance? More troubling is that this special budgetary reserve fund the administration insists is needed to balance the following year's budget never seems to actually get spent. Why is that? Well, one need look no further than how well revenues and expenses in the proposed budgets have been estimated. Every year, for the past 5 years, revenues have been underestimated and expenses overestimated. This has resulted in multi-million-dollar surpluses every one of these years, including this past one. Look at page 60 of the last year's audit and the equivalent page 70s of the 4 previous audits to see for yourself. When I did Pentagon budgeting, we called that padding the budget. Now, I'm sure this is entirely unintentional here. Still, after 5 years with the same result, one has to wonder. Next, Mrs. Wallen lays out very troubling cost growth. The demographic study this board commissioned in 2019 predicted the GASD student body population would decrease by 152 students by 2029. So any increases in expenses are certainly not due to increases in students. You should demand to see detailed and comprehensive backup substantiation for every one of the spending increases the administration is predicting. Finally, on the revenue side, I'm sure you know that the Gettysburg Area District is in a growth spurt. Between just the links at Gettysburg and Amblebrook, more than 2,300 new upscale homes will be sold in the $500,000 range. At the end of construction, property tax revenues at the current millage rate will have increased by about $11 million per year. What's more, being a 55-plus community, Amblebrook will not burden the school district with the expense of even a single new student, and only a few will come from the links. Given the district's outrageous excess reserves, the anticipated increase in property tax revenue from new home growth, and the expected shrinking of the district's student body, I could easily stand here and make a case that the present tax rate should actually be reduced until a better fiscal balance is achieved. I certainly hope you are considering that option yourselves. Most importantly, what you don't know, as far as I can tell, is how well the district administration is managing its present budget. If you wait to see the audit for this year, you will be next March before you ever know. Why do you put up with that? The Upper Adams Budget Office prepares a monthly tracking report for its board before every meeting. It provides a year-to-date snapshot of how revenue and expenses are tracking what was budgeted. Mrs. Wallen used to be the budget manager at UASD, so she must know how to prepare that report. Why aren't you demanding to see one for Gettysburg area so that you're not flying blind to the administration's budget preparation smokescreen? Ladies and gentlemen, what kind of oversight board do you intend to be? We did not elect you to crawl in bed with the administration and rubber stamp their demands, or to go along, just to get along with them, which is the excuse I heard for last year's tax increase. I hope as this budget process unfolds, you will come to better understand the financials of the entity you oversee, then act in the best interest of both the students and the taxpayers. The administration has put forth grand estimates of expense increases it expects in the coming year. The 4% tax increase they are hinting at will generate about $1.3 million in additional revenue. At 2%, even less. Why would you even consider agreeing to that when the available reserve fund is $3 to $4 million more than you are even legally entitled to hold? Every one of you knows how to get in contact with me by now. If you want more clarification of what I've said here tonight, please do. And finally, please remember again that any tax increase you levy is for sure going to push some of your neighbors closer to losing their homes. Any such tax increase had better be very well justified. Thank you for the board's time, Mr. President.
Thank you. Routine approvals, 5.1 through 5.3, may I have a motion?
So moved.
Question? Thank you. Question on the motion? Roll call. Mike? Yes. Michelle?
Yes.
Kevin? Yes. Jeremy?
Yes.
Amy Beth?
Yes.
Al?
Yes.
And I vote yes. As you'll see under item 6, items for board action, this evening we do not have any. We're moving on to our informational items, one at a time. 7.1 is the SRO Police Services information. As a reminder to the board before I turn it over, actually, I'm going to turn that over because some of that stuff was in executive session. Jason?
Yeah, sure. This is just an update in terms of where we are. The last board action a couple of meetings back, just to direct us to pursue other options for school resource services based on a lack of municipal partners responding to the RFP that was placed a couple of months back. So just going to share kind of where we are and what we plan to do, unless directed otherwise by the board. So Belinda will jump in here as well, and here with us tonight over in at the end of the table. We have Dave Walker from Apple Used and Z assisting us with the process as he has assisted similar districts with similar needs in the past to be able to answer any questions that come up. So thanks for joining us this evening. So we've been without SRO services since about February 25th or so, based on the agreement being terminated with Cumberland Township. Obviously, we still continue to have the need, and did see the need likely growing as opposed to dissipating as we move through the next couple of years. One of the things we've looked at, without a municipal partner, was the ability to have oversight of personnel associated with that role. So one option we looked at and are pursuing at this point would be to bring kind of SRO police services under the umbrella of the school district. That would enable us to hire the folks associated with the program. It would allow us to also control costs moving forward, as opposed to a contracted service where we would have a little bit less control of the finances of that moving forward. So there are a couple of things that would need to occur in the correct order to pursue that kind of plan. And that plan is similar to there are other local school districts that provide their services in that manner. Some of the closer to us geographically being Chambersburg, and I know that Waynesboro, I believe, also has an officer that's a district employee. So there are a couple of board policies that we would need to create / update. Our plan would be to bring those to policy committee in its meeting in May to take a look at that. We would also share a job description for an Act 93 position for basically to oversee safety, security, police services. And that will be shared as information with the board in a meeting, shortly after the policies are go to the board for first read. We would, at that point, we would look to probably hire the individual that would kind of oversee the program to allow them to build district procedures for police services. And so a lot of the early fall work this coming year would probably be that person kind of working on that, as well as being able to, when approved by the court, responding to issues that come up as well. And then as a district, we would just look to see, when does it make sense to add, future officers to the one with the director, and then building all of those things into the budget. So we already have built into the budget the price of basically the SRO that we've had in place for a number of years. So really, it's building a small amount in for some supplies, and building a small amount in, which might end up being maybe like a half the year's salary, if that would be done somewhat mid-year next year. So those are the kinds of things that we're working through right now. Our attorney, the reason that you're working with him is because he's worked with other districts going through the same process. Each individual that the district would want to be certified as a police officer would need to be approved by the Court of Common Pleas. So that process would also be a part of what we're attempting to do. So we certainly appreciate the fact that obviously law enforcement still responds when we need them to. For emergencies, we call. Obviously, if it's an acute emergency, building's always down 911, but we call the non-emergency number whenever we simply need someone to stop by as a resource, and it's not an acute issue. So we appreciate the work that all of those folks do. I think we've experienced that our needs are acute enough that we need folks within the district is there anything that I missed in kind of that very general overview that you have notes regarding, or did I cover it?
I believe the one to follow up and just indicate is once we move forward with looking at the individual, the court decisions will be required needed. I don't recall if I heard you mention that, that's something I probably need to add.
Yeah. And then, one of the reasons we asked Dave to be here tonight, that's required for each individual. We can't get a blanket approval from the district, correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. The way, and just by way of background, ladies and gentlemen, it's Article, I believe, 13 of the school code that was amended quite a bit by Act 67 of 2019. And what that basically did was expanded a lot the safety and security measures that school entities could take. So we're kind of operating within that. And you'll see that there's a distinction there between school police officers and school resource officers. You've been operating through a school resource officer who's a police officer of an outside agency who's assigned here as a duty post. We're now shifting, as Dr. Parent mentioned, where that person could possibly be in-house as your employee. But school district employees of their very nature don't necessarily have the police powers that you would need this person to have, the authority to arrest, to detain, and possibly, if court approved, to carry a firearm. There's a mechanism under the school code where you petition the local court of common pleas with a simple petition that includes the individual's name and their credentials, including that they've satisfied certain items that are required by the school code, either having been a member of the state police and was honorably discharged, or completing the municipal police officer basic training course, and also completing the National School Resource Officer training course, or equivalent that's been identified by the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency. Once we put together all that information to show that they have the qualifications that match the code, you petition to the court, and then the court authorizes that individual police powers. And then once they go and take the oath of office and have that oath filed with the court, they then have the ability to exercise police powers within their jurisdiction for the school district, including up to carrying a firearm. So that's how that process goes, but because it's based on individual qualifications, every time an officer comes up, we have to get their paperwork, fill out that filing, and submit it to the court here in Alexandria.
So the first step in May is we would bring the 3 policies to the policy committee, and Dave's been working with us actually on those policies. So by the time we bring those to policy committee in May, he will also have reviewed those prior to them coming to the committee meeting. And he's been very helpful in providing some examples, and we have a lot of stuff that we can continue down this road. The person will be able to use as a resource in terms of procedures and those kind of things in the district. But we just thought that it would be good to just share kind of where we were with that this evening. And certainly if there are any questions, you can ask them of us or email us at a time, and I'm happy to answer.
Any questions from the board? Excuse me again. Thank you, Jason. 7.2, policy on electronic devices. Mike, you were policy, so do you mind sharing with us actually 7.2 and 7.3? I think we can almost combine those.
Sure, absolutely. So the policy committee met last week, and we reviewed policy 237 and policy 815. And after a very productive discussion, the actual substance of the policy, as it was first brought to the board a couple of weeks ago, did not change. It's identical, actually. So I think the discussion will come later on as we review the student handbook and how some of those things are going to be handled. So essentially, this is just a second read of the original 237 and 815 that came to the board 2 weeks ago.
Do any of the board members have any questions? .4, 2022-2023 budget information, I believe. Are you handling that?
So here is our 2-week update from the April 4th presentation. this evening. So where we've gone from what has changed from before. So local revenue has increased. We took a look at the collection rate percentage of real estate taxes, adjusted that collection percentage as well as looking at the earned income collections, considering trend over the past few years. So you'll see in the collection in the column which is labeled 0%, third column in from the left, it went to 45,936, 960. This includes an increase of about almost $750,000 in revenue, and then likewise, just providing the numbers if in the event there was questions related to 2% or 4%. 4% is the index, is the max. I'm not sitting here recommending that at every point in time. We wanted just to make sure that we're aware of the numbers. At this point in the conversation, we are still examining our revenue as well as our expenditures very closely. We have a call into the assessment office to give us some additional updated data so that we can make sure that we're addressing our assessment data with the current mill rate at 0%. So first and foremost, we're anticipating that to come in any day. And so really, state revenue has stayed status quo, the same. That is the same as current collections. We pretty much in our 2021 actual budget, we had overestimated our state revenues, and we actually came in a little less. So we feel as if the budget projection for current year should retain into 22-23. The no new news on the governor's side of the budget, so of course we're proposing that we're going to keep status quo with the current budget and the state sources. Federal sources, of course, came down in terms of taking out the ESSER dollars, as which we previously discussed before. So in essence, we're looking at a 0% tax increase at $67,013,740. On the other opposite side of the equation, which is the expense, we also addressed expense, and we're now down to 2.7% increase of expenditures. And where we did some changes here is some of the reserves we reduced, some of the removed some interns, we reduced some positions for professional development leave. We also reduced some of the LIU special services in terms of LIU learning support services, and then emotional support services for secondary support. All services provided by Lincoln Intermediate Unit. Felt comfortable with reducing those numbers in terms of based upon historical trends. We were able to bring that down. We reduced expenditures on this particular slide, $955,845. So our total change from April 4th budget is $1.6 million, which now we're at 72.7% expenditures previously. So in terms of fund balance, which we've heard some discussion and some comments earlier, as well as where we wanted to discuss too here is this is a projection, and budget numbers will change regularly as we continue to monitor revenue and expenditures. But overall, this worksheet is set up to say if we're going to comply with our policy, which is 6 to 8% in unreserved fund balance, we would need to retain $4.2 million, which is at the very bottom of this worksheet. We began a constant fund balance of June 30th of 21 at $6.6 million. That is in the audit. That is available. So we know for certain those funds are available at a particular point in time. However, we did not account for the reserve budgetary portion that is currently appropriated in the current school year, because we're in the assumption that we would use those funds appropriately. So the place to begin on our viewpoint is, what is the constant? So $6.6 million of the unreserved. That is just unreserved only. That is not all the appropriations of fund balance. We have 4 to 5 additional appropriations of fund balance, which are not calculated in 68% calculations. and they are not considered as a part of what can be raised or lowered in taxes. It is the only unreserved portion by state requirements that we will need to adhere by. So of course, from the previous slides, our revenue, which is proposed, and I'm going to use a 0.0% column, is revenue is proposed at $66.5 million. We plan to use some of the committed PSERS fund. If you'll recall, we have a portion of PSERS dollars that we have set aside between now and another 8 years. And so this $485,000 is the attempt to bring down those funds, utilize those funds for the actual increase in PSERS dollars, because we know that PSERS increases is going to keep increasing up towards 37% within the next 10 years. So of course, the next line down is the expense budget, which from the slide previously is $71.27 million. Taking into those considerations, what are we allowed to use from our fund balance without necessarily dropping below the 6% fund balance policy? That's $2.4 million. So in this 0% guide, we have intentions to use $2.4 million of unassigned fund balance to help offset the difference between revenue and expenditures. That leaves then, of course, in the 0% world, we have $1.8 million that we're still working to try to find to balance the budget.
How much?
$1.8 million in a 0% increase. If we were to look at a 2% increase, we're looking to find $1.1 million. And if it's the max index increase, then we're looking to fund about $500,000. Now, this can be done in two ways. Looking at the additional revenues, adding revenues, or reducing expenditures. It's one of the two ways. There's no other additional means unless one other option, the board wants to consider reopening your fund balance policy to drop it below 6%, and make means there. But otherwise, this is presented as to what the policy is at a minimum of 6%. Again, so we are still waiting on some data from the assessment office, and we will continue to monitor the revenues and update accordingly. And we also are meeting with the administrators to discuss budgets, I believe tomorrow, so we should have more of an update then. But what I wanted to share at this particular point in time, the goal is on May 2nd is to bring back and recommend and adopt a proposed budget. That is going to be necessary, pretty much this particular budget which you see in front of you, and simply because while we're still making changes and up to the very end to the budget adoption, we will continue to make those changes, but we need, according to the Act 1 guidelines, we need to have the budget on display by at least 30 days prior to any action taken on the final budget. So therefore, we would recommend to have it proposed and listed as a proposed final budget. That doesn't mean to say that the budget that I'm presenting this evening is going to be the final budget. It is just simply to make it available for public viewpoint, advertisement, meeting all the requirements underneath the Act 1 guidelines so that we have it on available. We may come to find out that we need to push our meeting back to a final adoption. Very well could happen. But again, it's one of those, wanted to point out is the timeline that's coming up is while we still do not know what our state timeline is for revenue, we still need to abide by a budget and pass it by June 30th. I would like to, any questions at this particular point in time from anybody from the board? I also love to hear your board perspective about the deficit that is shown that we looked earlier on these two sides. I think we're making considerable gains, but we are still in need to find a considerable amount of money there.
So for May, basically, that first meeting in May, what we would do is wherever we are in terms of revenues and expenditures, we would bring that to the meeting as a budget for board approval. And then we would continue to work through May and part of June to continue to make any changes that are helpful before we do a final budget review.
So Belinda, Tim's not here, so I'll ask the question he asked several times. When or are you able to show us the revenue growth from the housing industry within our district? I know, I think you just said you factored in some of that.
We
So at
did,
some point, how are you getting that projection that says that X number of homes are coming in at this rate, and the district is, not maybe, will be receiving X amount of revenue, and this is where it's factored in the budget?
right, so typically the county will produce their updated assessment data reports. And presently, we have not received a new one in order to update these numbers. The last one, I believe, was the March timeline, we received assessment. So once we know what that assessment data is, that'll have all the properties that are on parcels, all property that have come and been put on parcels. That does not represent interim parcels. So we are waiting on this, on the county to provide us the data for interim parcels, so we can get a better estimate of what's going to be coming onto the rolls. But for tax parcel rolls themselves, we rely on the county's data, and then we, of course, take that assessment data, calculate it out. The collection percent is of concern, of course. We take whatever the assessment data is, times the mill rate, times the collection data of 96.5%, and there's our revenue that we base it off of. And we're continually looking at that. As soon as we're getting updated reports, we're providing it. We do have a call into the assessment office to ask the specific question that Tim had requested, exactly of how many parcels are coming on that they know of at this particular point in time. A lot of times what will happen is you may not always know those numbers exactly, and therefore your interim taxes will fluctuate from year to year as well. Once it becomes a permanent parcel, that is when it's added to the real estate tax parcel.
Right, but that fluctuation is a manageable fluctuation, you would agree, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So I'm gonna go back 6 years. I'm gonna ask the question, you weren't here.
Mhm.
And I wanna make sure I understand this. The board adopted a policy 6 to 8%, nothing under, no. The rule 6 to 8%. The board, at some point prior to my arrival, adopted a policy that we would not take the unassigned fund balance below 6%. But each year when we look at the audit, and I think there's where some confusion on my part comes in, is, I'll give you a second here to answer this, is you always see that extra, that fund balance that we take to 6% to balance a budget, all of a sudden is sitting at 10 to 12 when the audit comes in. And is it my understanding, what you're proposing is if that's gonna continue, then you're taking that money, and then you're using that from the unassigned fund balance to put back into the new budget to offset the expense revenue. Would that be correct?
Correct. That would be in this instance $2.4 million, or for this slide in itself. So whenever we know that difference, we apply it to the very next budget cycle. So it's not necessarily just sitting and growing in reserve. We're applying it to the next budget cycle.
I think where most people get confused when I have individual conversations is that they see a number and subtracted from that number is what we're using for the current budget and what was set aside to be used for this year's budget.
Sorry, Jason. I don't understand what you mean.
So I'll just make up some numbers here. So if you had $10 million of fund balance, if we're using $2 million to plug the gap of the current year's budget, then you're really starting with 8. So then when you use 2.4 to plug the gap for next year's budget, you're drawing it down the curve.
Okay, can I ask a question?
Sure.
We heard Mr. Stillwell, and he's talking about this assigned balance fund.
Mm-hmm.
What is it, what's it for?
Unassigned fund balance,
He's talking about an assigned.
the assignment is just designated for another purpose, just like committee funds. It is a means to set aside funds for a specific purpose.
For instance, the district has money in a reserve account to deal with Beezer's costs. We have money set aside, you can probably give other examples, Linda, but we have money designated to balance this current year's budget.
So you're telling me that the assigned fund is to help balance this year's budget?
That's correct. A portion of it, yes, yes.
Okay, because, I mean, I'm a happy camper, and I don't blame them. I mean, I pay taxes here too, so I just want to make sure the air's clear and we all understand what we're talking about. I mean, it's still a little fuzzy to me. And let me ask you one other question. So when we were here 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, whatever it was, something that you said stuck out to me, and it was that since the booster club is no more, that we were gonna see a 10% increase in, like, the sports budget. So, what is it that the booster club was providing that is gonna be 10% of that budget? Because that, I mean, let's be honest, the sports budget is a pretty big budget.
You're correct. It is, and it will grow continuously now that we do not have GWABC. And so GWABC provided for the dinner, the rewards dinner. It provided for the banners, the pins, the Gs. It provided for even uniforms that our own district budget couldn't do. And those uniforms were specific to maybe students want their name on it. They want a shirt that they can keep and have. So it was a name put on the jersey. It was addressed to that, things like that. Let me think, also some fundraising supplies and activities that did. So the GWAC was able to fundraise and to provide additional resources back to those sports. And we had to include those expenditures along with our athletic disclosure requirement, which is a required filing with the department. We had to include those expenditures. Now that GWC is no longer going to be providing those, the district is going to assume to pay those because, of course, we've got to provide the same level of service that we've had before, unless we want to start looking at diminishing and changing our sports programs. So, we were anticipating this to occur, and so therefore, we had to increase the budget line items for the athletic funds to take care of. And if you'd like, I can get you a whole list of items, looking at GWBC's financial information.
I mean, I understand that, it's just, my older kids play sports. Soccer moms ran a concession stand and we paid for our dinner, we paid for their awards. Just kind of like, I don't know, maybe I'm wondering why team moms aren't doing that. Well, I don't think, and I can tell you, Jake knows, we've had kids that all played on the same soccer team. We didn't rely on the booster club for a lot to do for our teams. And it's probably different now because we don't have the same number of parents that get involved and help and do everything. I understand that, but that's gonna be something that I would look at. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff that I would look at, but yes, if you can do this, it would be great.
Sure, absolutely.
Linda, I think it'd be helpful to, at some point, I'm not gonna put you on the spot this evening, instead of using 10%, do you come up with, if you can provide a figure on what the district has had to take over in terms of an actual expense? Are you telling me it's $1,000, or are you telling me it's $20,000? I think that's helpful there too. And it's unfortunate because the Boosters Club was such an integral part of the Gettysburg community in so many ways outside of the financial end of this. It's unfortunate we didn't have anybody step up.
Is it an option to start the booster club again?
There, and Mr. Walker may be able to start the booster in that fashion, it takes probably 9 months to a year to get established. All the following requirements that have to be have that status, then you can apply for games of chance and things of that nature. So there's more fundraising activities that a nonprofit organization can do. The school cannot. So we are not, our mission is not to be a games of chance district to where we're supporting fundraising activities. It needs to follow a nonprofit organization process to get there. In a high level, I don't know the exact number, but the last time I looked, it was almost 35,000 for the increase in supplies for athletic expenses. GWEC did not take it.
Across the board.
Yes.
So what you're telling me is the board sat here throughout whatever extended period of time and we let the booster clubs licensing lapse or closed out, correct? Mr. Walker, do you agree with me?
I don't have the full background, but that seems consistent with this conversation.
So is that true?
Yeah, I believe that the person that was running the GWAC, I can't think of his last name right now, but Jeff, he was on the scout looking.
Jeff Hingham.
He was on the scout looking for folks to try to step up and take it
For
over.
years, they were
For
very
years.
Right.
For years. And so, our next mission is to probably look at GAEF Foundation, how probably help provide that local support since they're a nonprofit organization. But until we get that process rolling, because they're not set that way at the moment, we're looking into it. But we still need to continue the level of expenditures and some of the items that have been purchased previously. It was nice because the athletic department was able to work directly with Jeff Neal, and a lot of the coaches worked directly with Jeff Neal, that whenever they needed a request or they were using the funds that were held at GWAC. So it was a nice arrangement while it lasted. So of course now we see some of the fall spring on that. But I'll be more than happy to get you a list because I remember following the disclosure requirement, realizing how much money has passed through GWAC because, between the fundraising and all the expenses that they provided us, it's quite a bit.
I have another quick question. A while back, Jason spoke to the board, and I believe you also had some comments before we passed the resolution to look long-term over the next 5 to 6 years in terms of balancing the budget with revenue and expenditures. So the budget, the proposed budget, or the information you're giving us, how is that playing into what our long-range goal is, that we're not sitting here each year with a stack here and a stack here, and then it's like playing a coconut game with what underneath each year where we're at. So how's this playing into that?
So our long-range goal is for our revenue to equal expenditures in every way, shape, or form. So while we are continuing to draw down fund balances, unreserved fund balances, at some point in time, those funds will not be available to continue to help put in towards the budget. So therefore, that comes the long-range plan to say if there's no unreserved funds to help fund your next year's budget, we then need to look at revenue expenditures must match because we don't have the reliance on fund balance. And again, it's a long-range projection. It's not something that we're going to be able to get there next year or 2 years from now. It is something that's going to work over time. For example, as the PSERS committed fund draws down, every year we're able to take about $475,000 to help supply revenue towards the budget to offset the PSERS increases. As that fund is diminished, then every increase in PSERS, we hope that it decreases within 8 years. But the rate it's going, it's not. And so, of course, that would be our concern 10 years from now. What are we going to do with PSERS? Because if it's not decreasing and we've already used the committed funds to offset that, then it is general fund dollars, and it's the unreserved fund balance picking up the difference. So it's a matter, and while some say it is a shell game, sometimes it is, simply because, you are, when you're budgeting, I will say this, and it comes up quite a bit, when you're budgeting, you can't be over 8%. And so our district has continually used a committed PSERS as well as committed fund balance to help offset that budget. So, in a nutshell, we have always made sure that, in essence, that we are falling below or at 60% below that rate to, if the need to pull for taxes is there, it's there. I'm not saying coming out of the gate that we need to increase taxes next year. I still think we have a lot of work to do, but again, as those committed funds disappear, and they will, I apologize I wasn't here 5 years ago, but I think just from me being here 2 years, we have been effortlessly decreasing the reliance of fund balance when we're budgeting. But that's not to say that it's going to continue all the time. But the five-year plan is to make sure that we're maximizing every level. But we don't need to rely on fund balance.
Right, we've been getting more accurate really each year. If you look up at the slide that's still on the screen, for instance, so if we end up utilizing, say, 2.4 million from fund balance, that'll be way less than we used for the current year,
Yes.
which means that the gap between revenues and expenditures is getting smaller. So we're better predicting the budget if the gap's getting smaller. Also, over the past 5 years, I believe that when I came, the collection rate was about 93%, I believe. So each year we've increased the collection rate so that we can better predict the local revenue. So that's why we're using kind of 3 and 5 year trends, and why we're using a larger percentage at this point, so that we're better at predicting local revenue and not under predicting it. So those are some of the things that we've been doing over the past couple of years. I know that my first year here was 17-18, so the first budget we did was obviously 18-19. I think the budget is currently about $5 million more than it was 5 years ago. So I think that it's probably about 8% increase over 5 years. And we're a people-heavy organization, so people costs obviously drive our budget. So there are things like healthcare and PSERS and our contracts that increase each year. So I think we've done a really good job actually of holding the costs that we can control, because we've only seen an 8% increase over 5 years in a organization where 2/3 of our costs are people oriented. So I think that we do our best, and for the final budget in June, we always try to come back with the lowest that it can possibly be. So we'll continue to do that this year.
And I just want to say that I appreciate those efforts to try to make our projected and our actuals on revenue and expenses a lot closer. And I think we have done, just in the short time I've been on the board, we've done a much better job at that. But I also realize as a public school, we can't overspend. That's not an option for us. So Belinda, I appreciate the fact that we budget somewhat conservatively, that we do give ourselves a little bit of cushion revenue-wise and expense-wise. So in a couple of weeks on May 2nd, this board is going to be asked to approve a preliminary budget. I'm assuming it's going to be the administration is going to recommend one of those 3 options up there. I do think, looking at regardless of which option we choose, we're going to have to cut expenses. Even at 4%, we're going to have to cut over $500,000. At 0%, just under $2 million. I think it would be helpful if we had an idea on all 3 of those options, what areas on the expense side would we be cutting? Where are those priorities? And that would it would help me. I'm guessing it would help others to see just how painful that's going to be, whether it be 0, 2, or 4. But I think that would be very helpful. But then something else, and I know this might be sacrilegious to say it, and so on. I think maybe given the circumstances with inflation and what's happening in the world right now and so on, taking a look and sending our policy of 6 to 8% fund balance. I know it keeps us a good credit rating. It makes me nervous going lower than that. But I think given the circumstances, maybe all options are on the table and we consider maybe 4 to 6% is a better number. And again, I, at the risk of saying that out loud, it's a little scary because I don't want us to lose our great credit rating, and I don't want us to get scarily below a number that, because there are unforeseen things that can happen across the district that can cause you to use your savings account pretty quick, just like in a family savings account. But I appreciate that.
Yeah, we absolutely want to make sure that we keep our credit rating, because the costs of a lower credit rating will be far greater than anything that we're saving on the front end of that. But I didn't answer your initial question, or maybe it was out. So on the third, what we'll do is we'll continue to see if there are places where we can increase revenue, places where we can reduce expenditures, and wherever we are at that point, the recommendation would be where we are at that point. That won't be where we are necessarily in June, but it'll be where we are in May.
Understood.
Actually, Belinda, I'm going with Alan's first part, not the second part. It would be helpful as we go to proposed. And again, we keep going to proposed. It is a proposed budget. It is not the final budget. Every year I've been on here, we've proposed something. We've never adopted what we've proposed. It's always been lower, always.
That's correct.
To zero, actually. So it's a proposed budget. But certainly if the district is bringing a budget consideration to the board, I'll echo what Al's saying, is that if that's what your proposal is, it certainly would be helpful to see the impact or where cuts take place. And I'm not specifically saying where the board would vote on each thing like happened in Elizabethtown. I don't think I would ever let that happen here. I mean, but board members gotta make their own decisions. But that, I will echo, when you come with that, would you please illustrate that for us?
Belinda.
Any other questions on the budget stuff?
Belinda, I think on our agenda, that wasn't attached.
We're gonna post this on the website,
Oh, great.
as well
Thank you.
as on the show.
Thank you.
Yes. If I could, Mr. President, I would like, since Mr. Moyer had mentioned about credit rating, we just recently had our S&P rating, because we were about ready to begin purchasing our bonds after our resolution to maximize that. And so, with the gentleman with S&P, we did sustain a AA- stable rating on our analysis. However, he did say, because he did see us purposely reducing our fund balance, that of course, while we obtain a stable outlook, if the continuation of fund balance continues to decline, they could then also request to open up and provide another credit rating, which would be a downward slide from AA-. The credit rating itself, like you mentioned, like Dr. Perrin mentioned, it is factored in when we are receiving those rates and the date that we lock in. So if it becomes, while it's not the only factor, it's relatively important, the stability of how we manage and operate our financial resources in terms of folks that are going potentially buying bonds and securing those funds with us for a long-range goal.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions on the budget information this evening? Hearing on 7.5, the achievement report.
Good evening.
Dr. Lay.
Good evening. Chris Lay, Assistant Superintendent. I have a presentation to share as we finally were able to receive all of the achievement and growth data based on the 2020-21 school year assessments. So our first slide just gives an overview of the demographics of our district. Okay, what's not showing on the enrollment side is the percentage of students in ESL, gifted, special education, and economically disadvantaged. The most significant being our percentage of students who are considered economically disadvantaged, eligible for free and reduced lunch services at approximately 45%. So looking at this first frame, this looks at our PSSA performance for 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade students for both ELA and math. In 2021, the first breakdown is the percentage of students that scored proficient or advanced. And the percentage for 3rd grade was 66% district-wide, compared to our state average, slightly above that. And what's worth noting is the 2019 proficient advance for the district at 67%. So looking at that, this was a year during the pandemic, which elementary students were in person most days, but we certainly had our disruptions and kids on significant quarantine breaks and other impacts of COVID, but it's nice to see that our performance overall was not as impacted, as it is fairly similar to 2019 because there were no assessments administered in spring of 2020 when the schools were shut down. If we look at math for 3rd grade, again, 60% of the students scoring proficient or advanced in 2021, more significantly above the state average, and again, not much off from what 2019's percent was, of 62%. For 4th grade, 64% of our students for ELA scoring at or above proficient, and again, above state average. There's a little more discrepancy from where we were in 2019 for this group. And then in math, 53% of our students scoring advanced or proficient, even more significantly above the state average of 36%. And again, the difference then with 2019 at 62%, excuse me. And then if we look at 5th grade, 63% of our students scoring proficient or advanced on the PSSA last year, again above the state average and above the 2019%. And with math, 53%, and again scoring above the state average, and again scoring above the percentage of students from 2019. We look at our 6th grade students. This group of students, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, would have been on an A-B schedule last year. So it's important to note that there are more discrepancies in certain situations from how their performance was in 2019. With 67% of our students scoring proficient or advanced for ELA, again above the state average and very aligned to 2019%. More discrepancy in math, only 35% of the students scoring advanced or proficient. It does exceed the state average, but it is below where we were in 2019. With ELA in 7th grade, again, 61% above the state average, comparatively to 72% in 2019. And then our math scores in 7th grade, 22%, which is below the state average, and quite significantly below the 49% from 2019. ELA for 8th grade, 57% of our students scoring at or above proficient, again above the state average, and with some disparity from 2019, and then only 30% of our students scoring advanced or proficient in math. They are above the state average, but quite a significant drop from 2019. So again, the math scores were more significantly affected by our students with sharing an A-B schedule and Fridays off during COVID. With the science performance, 86% of our 4th grade students scored proficient or advanced, which is exactly what they did in 2019. So we saw no difference there. 8th grade, it was 57% scoring advanced proficient. Again, it's above the state average, but less so than 2019. Mr. Lusk is going to talk quickly about the high school algebra and biology. But before he does that, the middle school students who took the algebra keystone in 2021, 90% of those students scored advanced or proficient. Typically, we have 100% by 2019, but those students took the keystone as 8th graders, but Mr. Lusk is going to talk a little bit about how those scores are banked for their 11th grade year and how that affected high school.
Dr. Lay, real quick question. The statewide goals, does the Department of Ed establish those goals? And I noticed in a couple of the areas here, we actually outdid that one, but some of the other ones earlier, it seemed like the goal was way off compared to where the state average was or Gettysburg.
All right, yes, the state established those goals at the onset of this PA Ready Index. Now, they may adjust those based on COVID, but for now, that's what they are.
Hello, Jeremy Lusk, principal of the high school. I asked Mrs. McConaughey to pass out some handouts. It'll help explain a little bit visually who we're talking about, because whereas 4th graders are 4th graders and 7th graders are 7th graders, when you get to the high school data report, this slide speaks to our, as the handout explains, 11th grade cohort of 2021. So we're actually looking at data for our graduating seniors. So this speaks to our 2022 graduates. Last year, they finished their 11th grade year, and in the world of Keystones, they don't report on Keystones until all students have finished their 11th grade year. I've included a couple pages just so, again, you can kind of see where and when these students tested in particular areas. So we'll just start with algebra. So our 11th graders last year, when the dust settled, 80% of them were proficient or advanced, slightly above the 2019 numbers. And if you turn to page 2 in your handout, and I just want you to understand this, because this won't be seen on the Future Ready dashboard that you will see if you look it up, or that anybody from the public would see. Most of our algebra students test in 9th grade, if not 8th grade, as Dr. Lay just said. So we have some students who will take the test in 8th grade, we have some who will take the test in 9th grade, and a few who will take it after that. So if you look at the page 2 of the handout, many of these students took the algebra exam in the winter of 2018-19 or the spring of 2019, before COVID set in. So the scores look pretty good in that regard, and most of our students did indeed take that test and are included in this particular graph. That is not the same for biology, where here you see 55% were proficient or advanced, and that is down from 2019, and it's below the state average, but you should know it only represents 30 students. So most of our biology students take that exam. If you look at the 3rd page in your handout, in the sophomore year. Most of them were sophomores in the 2019-20 school year. So we did have a portion, as it says on the handout, 86 students who took the exam during the winter 2019-2020 exam window. We did have a few students who took the exam as 9th graders the year before. And then we always have move-ins and students that come in and that we see that they haven't taken the Keystone. So whether they're in one of our biology classes or not, we try to make sure that every student who's going to be in 11th grade takes the Keystone before they leave us. So you have an array of testing windows that these students have taken. All of the scores in the 2019-2020 school year are not included in any data reports that you'll see from the state or for us. Nonetheless, like I said, we did have 86 students who took the test, but many students, our most advanced students, did not test in the spring, which is when most of our advanced students take the biology exam. So again, it's a limited pool of data. You won't see in front of you or on the PA Future Ready dashboard literature, because 11 students took the literature exam. Again, that's a test that most of our students take during the sophomore year, with few exceptions. We did have a few students take it their junior year, but again, we're only talking about 11, which is why it's not included. So if you look at the handouts that I gave you, over on the far left-hand side, highlighted in orange, that is when most of our students took the test. I'm going to pass it back to Dr. Lay. But first, this speaks to the advanced score, so you'll see this on the dashboard as well. Again, we don't have a significant pool of test takers in literature, so insufficient data. If you look at mathematics, 37.8% of our test takers scored in the advanced range, well above the state average. And though we had a limited number of students taking the biology test, we did have, because some of these students were actually ninth graders before the 2019-2020 school year, there were a good number of students who were advanced, again, above the state average.
The next slide speaks to what's considered growth data from PVAS. So what they did is combine the elementary and middle school data on our district report card. And in 2019, when those scores were combined for math, we were showing that we had met the expected growth for students. And with 2021, we are well above the expected growth for students in math on the PSSAs. There's a very long algorithm that is utilized to calculate what the expected growth is. But the exciting thing is that based on the combined scores, PSSAs, grades 3 through 8, we showed very good growth for 2021. And
Dr. Lay?
Yes.
Just clarification. The meets, and I love the value added and the growth. To me, that's really what we have some degree of control over,
right.
rather than arbitrary scores. Meets, does the Department of Ed define that as a year's worth of instruction, is a year's worth of growth? Is that basically what meets? And then
Yes, it would be what's expected.
Gotcha.
That each student would grow at least 1 year. You're welcome. And then with the PVAS growth, again, 3 through 8 for PSSAs and ELA, in 2019, we were at the expected growth for meets, and we are well above the expected growth, actually well above, and that's the extra bracket at the end of that chart on 2021. And it can only provide science growth for 8th grade because 4th grade's the year they start the test. So in 2019, 8th grade was above, and we stayed above. We dropped a little bit, and again, this would be students who took this exam from being in school every other day in 2021. So given those conditions, it's still very good growth for our district. And Mr. Lusk is going to talk a little bit about the high school.
Where proficiency or advanced scores were banked for our 11th grade cohort, and we just spoke to that. This actually does speak to last year's test takers. So on the handout, I have PVAS growth highlighted in blue, then on the following pages, highlighted in blue are the scores from last year's testing window. Again, you'll see that in terms of growth, projected growth, which again is calculated with a pretty complex formula that is not something that ever gets shared with us, but really you take all the standardized testing that a student has ever been part of, and you look at other things like our school's historical performance with all learners, and they develop a target. And I thought it includes some numbers that, again, won't appear on our public dashboard nor on this presentation, but just so you understand They give you a target number, and I have a red arrow that points to these numbers on the first page. So for instance, we did well in terms of the expected growth for our algebra test takers last year, but as you can see, comparatively, 2021, that cohort of learners, the expectation was not as high as the 2019. So if you look at the enter achievement versus the exit, they were entered as a score, expected score of a 1473.4. We came out with a 1475.6, which is obviously a little bit higher, thus the green. If you look down at biology and literature, the expectation was in 2021 a score of a 1517.2. We came out with an average of a 1511.5. It's obviously below a 1517.2. It isn't far below. So while I get concerned when I look at growth and I see red and it seems alarming, just understand that we're still talking about on the end of things, our students came out with a 1511.5. It's not what was expected, which is why it's below green. The same is true for literature, where the expectation for that cohort of kids combined was a 1526.3, as you can see from your handout. We exited with a 1521.8. So still actually scoring relatively well as a group, just not growing as much as we would have during normal conditions, I would say. I also included our most recent test scores in your handout from the winter of 2021-22. So on the second, third, and fourth pages, if you look down, and you can see how our students did this past January when they tested. And you'll see that they're doing better. If you're going to compare numbers on your handout, maybe shoot me any emails with questions later. If you compare winter to winter and spring to spring, we usually have different types of learners in each semester. Again, sometimes we'll have more advanced learners in one semester. For instance, biology, all of our advanced biology students, we have them learning biology in the spring, so those scores always look better. So if you have any questions about that, I just thought I'd try and give you some of the details. Feel free to send me an email and ask questions. SATs, is there an AP slide before that?
Oh, wait, right now.
SATs then, whatever comes next. Oh, there it is.
1 second, there you go.
AP. I would say a typical year, maybe a little less so in terms of our AP test taking. Last year, we still had a significant number of students, 170 students taking AP exams, 299 exams taken in all. 65% of those resulted in a score of 3 or above, which is college grade learning. So a 3 can transfer as a college credit to most universities, or to many, I should say. More than that, it's a really solid, rigorous academic experience for students in a high school. So we still have plenty of students accessing advanced placement courses. We still, despite the challenges of last year, produce some good results. Some places better than others, but not too bad in terms of performance on AP. Our SAT scores are what you see, slightly above the state average and the national average score of 1144. And this speaks to industry-based learning, which is really career and technical education to high school. So we have plenty of students to access that type of learning. I think it's an area for growth because we have a lot of students that are taking AP courses and college and high school courses, and that's all well and good. It's good to challenge yourselves. Sometimes there might be a different pathway that might make more sense. So we'd like to actually see more participation in some of these areas and have some strategies to try and advance that cause in the future. But our students generally score pretty well. If you look at the students scoring advanced on the far right, you see that we're at an 8.3% compared to a state average of a 1.9. So our students do pretty well when they get their hands into those areas. This speaks to the rigorous courses of study, such as AP, but also college and high school programs. So we have courses in our high school and outside of our high school that students access, mostly HAC, but sometimes Harrisburg University and actually a few other schools offering college credits to our students. And we have plenty of students, as you can see, accessing those courses in addition to the AP courses. And the bottom graph that you see speaks to students concentrating in career and technical education. Again, a great place to learn that.
Okay, and just a few things to summarize as far as now what and what have we done this year, even though some of the data did not come out and wasn't made available to us until this school year. In anticipation, we have been working on our curriculum review process and revisions using the Understanding by Design model. We continue to use other assessments like benchmark assessments, progress monitoring data, because these scores are given to us and it's the end of a year snapshot that we don't get the data till typically moving into the next school year. So, we have other sources of data that are telling us what we need to do as far as adjustments to our instruction, interventions, targeted interventions for students, particularly in reading. We have a focused Tier 1 instruction, which is our core. We have funded through ESSER, a K-5 ELA and math instructional coach to support teachers and students at all three buildings. We have after-school tutoring for students grades 6 through 12 and an after-school program for elementary. We've built in summer learning opportunities for elementary and middle school students as well as credit recovery at the high school. And we adopted a new core phonics program at the elementary level and a digital content for ELA in grades K through 5. And that concludes our presentation. If you have any questions, we have principals here as well. Thank you.
Does the board have any questions? Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the team for putting that together and waiting out the state in terms of releasing the data. It kind of came out in pieces this year. So thanks for sticking to it and getting that done. I appreciate it.
It actually is a better report than what one would expect, given what the challenges were in the educational system. Thank you. Board committee reports. Amy Beth.
I have two this evening. The first, I'm going to start with my legislative report. I'm excited to detail two upcoming opportunities that I am to attend on our district's behalf. The first is the Spring Advocacy Day on April 25th. I will have my second time I will be attending and look forward to engaging with leaders on the Hill along with other school directors that are passionate about public education. The goal of this event is to raise awareness of social media and to strengthen support of public education. The second opportunity is a Board Leadership Monthly Exchange. The Board Leadership Exchange provides an opportunity for board presidents and vice presidents and liaisons like myself to network and learn about new and timely information to bring back to our districts. Those sessions will be held on the second Tuesday of each month and will go through June. I look forward to sharing these events with you. Please know that I am in constant communication with our representatives, both in the House and the Senate. Senator Mastriano and House Representative Dan Mao are working hard to ensure that our districts and their residents thrive because of the healthy working relationship that I have with both leaders. They are in tune with our needs of our district and vice versa. Communication and transparency are paramount to our success. Let me give you one example of many
the examples that I'm giving are very important. These are things that we work on in every month. We do meet on the first of each month with both gentlemen. Our state has been giving a report, the 2022 State Education Report, which is given by Pennsylvania Association of School Administrators, was released and has been given since 2017. The report serves as a barometer of indicators of performance of both our strengths and our weaknesses. I took the time to read this detailed report from top to bottom and relayed the findings to our representatives. I was able to thoughtfully discuss our current status, primarily with the focus of regaining the foothold of the COVID-19 pandemic. I have truly enjoyed being the one to facilitate this open dialogue. Working together will only allow us to achieve our goals. The second report that I have for you is on the LIU. Many new exciting things are happening on the LIU. As I promised you, when I took the office in this new role, that I would give reports, and I hope that that becomes the new norm. Let me start by explaining that the LIU is a full board that meets monthly with its own budget, board members, and leaders. The LIU is responsible for the special education of the students in the budget, and the budget is large. I take that seat very seriously, and I am only there to represent our district, but I am also there to represent Fairfield and Upper Adams. So let's get to the exciting stuff. We now, as our board, are full. We now have 13 members. That is something that hasn't happened in 5 years. I take this opportunity to have been sworn in. 2 meetings have happened since then, one after the other. I have witnessed new members being sworn in. This is exciting news for us because that's a new set of eyes on the budget and the happenings of the LIU. I would like to invite my fellow board members and members of our community to be our guests at the LIU graduation. This will be held on the May 24th, 25th, and 26th. They're in York and Franklin. Our LIU students, administrators, and teachers and parents have worked so hard to walk across the graduation stage. From what I'm told, and I hope to gather more information with the pictures and slides, is that this graduation is one of the more powerful things that you could ever go to. Watching a special education student, knowing what the teachers have gone through, knowing what the administrators have worked through to get through our COVID-19, and to see those children walk across the stage to gather their honorable graduation certificate is something that I really look forward to. So I will give an update on that as it comes. Finally, I've accepted a new position. I will be on the nomination committee for the LIU. I will be representing all of Adams County and will do my absolute best to fulfill the obligation. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Are there any additional board committee reports? Jeremy, Mike, no. Program reports, it's my understanding there are none, which leads us to our next meeting date, May 2nd at 7 p.m. And I would remind the board that we have a brief administrative conference immediately following this board meeting. I have a motion for adjournment. We stand adjourned.